Hello and thank you for joining me. My name is Rajia Hassib and today I will be talking to you about my second novel, A Pure Heart. First, many heartfelt thanks to the Gaithersburg Book Festival for bringing us together virtually from the safety of our own homes and for making it possible for us to still connect and share our love of books. I'm in awe of all the work that everyone must have put to bring the festival together, and I offer my sincere thanks. So everyone, Gaithersburg Book Festival, thank you. Now, I'm going to talk about the novel. It's mainly going to be talk with a few readings, very short readings interspersed in between as I need to help me tell you about the novel. So I'm going to just go ahead and start. I don't know about you, when I go to a bookstore, the first thing I do is when I'm browsing books, I pick up a book and I look at the first page and I read the first page of chapter 1. So I'm going to do that now. I think it helps set the tone and give you an idea of the voice of the novel. The only thing you need to know is before chapter 1, actually, the novel starts with a fictional newspaper clipping titled "Suicide Bomber Kills 9 in Egypt." So when you start chapter 1, you already know that there's been a suicide bombing, a terrorist attack in Egypt, and there have been 9 casualties. So let's start with chapter 1. On her last night in Egypt, Rose waits for her parents to fall asleep and then sneaks into her sister's bedroom. She sifts through the clothes strewn on the back of the chair, examines the contents of each desk drawer, picks through every nook of the armoire, then slides the mattress to the side and goes through the things stored under her sister's bed. Her own childhood bed, still standing in the room she used to share with her sister years ago, is covered with clothes, books, CDs, and papers, and Rose goes through those too. The items on the bed seem to be some of the ones her sister recently used. Gamila was never one for order, and from that pile, Rose picks out a pastel-colored scarf, blue and green with impressionist flowers that remind her of a painting of Monet, and drapes it on top of her head and across her face, inhaling deeply. Her sister's favorite perfume, flowery and fresh. She ties the scarf around her neck and continues with her search. She sets aside 2 t-shirts, a small box of jewelry, and a string of black prayer beads engraved with the 99 names of Allah, one name on each bead. Anything that seems potentially significant, she tosses onto the growing pile of things she intends to steal. She assures herself that she is an archaeologist, not a grave robber. So I'm going to stop here. Rose, the protagonist, is an Egyptian-American Egyptologist living in New York City, where she works at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and she is married to an American journalist called Mark. We find out, as you see from the first pages of the novel, that Rose's sister, Gamila, was one of the victims of the suicide bombing that you learned about from that newspaper clipping. Rose flies home to Egypt to console her parents, and before she goes back home again to the US, she decides to pick up some of her sister's things, to collect all of her sister's things that she can take back to the US with her and use them as artifacts. What Rose basically wants to do is find out what happened to her sister through the sister's belonging, through Gamila's belonging. She has multiple motives for that. Rose and Gamila had been somewhat estranged before Gamila's death, mainly because Gamila was much more religious than Rose and had trouble accepting the fact that Rose married an American, and due to other things as well. Rose didn't really know her sister well enough in her last years. In addition to that, Rose has good reason to suspect that her own husband, the American journalist Mark, may have been inadvertently involved in the events that led to her sister's death. So Rose needs to find out exactly what happened to Gamila and how she ended up at the site of the suicide bombing, because again, Rose thinks that this could not have been a coincidence considering the identity of the bomber. So the novel, as the novel progresses, we learn all the events that led to the suicide bombing through the point of view of Rose, of Gamila herself, and later on the actual suicide bomber, who gets his own chapters and his own voice. And we also follow Rose and Mark's marriage as we find out what happens to them, considering the strain that this event has put on their marriage. So I started writing this novel because I wanted to write about a terrorist attack. As a Muslim and an Egyptian American who has been living in the US since before 9/11, I always found the depiction of terrorist attacks to be a little bit simplistic. And I knew from experience, having grown up in Egypt in the 90s, where terrorist attacks were actually prevalent, that the motives are much more complex than people tend to assume. It's different when you grow up in a Muslim country and you get terrorists who commit such horrendous acts. You can't really blame it on the religion right away, right? You know, because you're of the same religion. They are not othered through their religion that way. So people have to dig a little bit more deeply to understand the motives. So I have lived through that in the 90s, and then of course I did my research here prior to writing the novel, and I wanted to write about a suicide attack and understand the events that can lead to such a horrendous act. Of course, the beautiful thing about writing is you start writing about one thing, you end up writing about 10 different things that you had no intention of even addressing. And I think that's one of the main things I love about this. It's kind of like slow thinking. It's thinking that takes place over drafts and years, and then the more you dig into the story and the characters, the more ideas come up and the more themes pop up. So I ended up writing the novel, and it became about many other things. It's about sisterhood, about two sisters who are different from each other but who still love each other. It's about ideological differences. The novel is set in Egypt, partly in Egypt and partly in the US, but some of the parts that are set in Egypt are set after the 2011 revolution. The interesting thing about that is after this revolution, I was following the people's attitudes and how they were discussing what was happening, and all of a sudden, after 30 years where politically almost nothing was happening in Egypt, all of a sudden there was the prospect of change, and with that came this increased sense of polarity. People belonged to one of two opposing political camps, and they fought viciously to defend their political views. The same households would have people from both camps. Husbands and wives ended up fighting. People were getting divorces. Siblings were not talking to each other. And I'm sure this sounds familiar because it was the same thing that has been happening here in the US in the previous years. So the novel is also partly about how to navigate that, how people react when those closest to them are so different ideologically. And then it also became about some of the themes that I picked up when I was researching ancient Egyptian history. And that led me to the main theme that actually lent the novel a title, where the title is coming from, A Pure Heart. So I'll get to that in a moment. But the novel is also about complexity, and it's about motives versus justification, the difference between what people say are their motives for acting or behaving the way they do and what their actual motives may be. And this is something that really interested me and that I actually found the main theme for, kind of the main system of metaphors for, through my ancient Egyptian research, my research into ancient Egypt. And that leads me to the next part that I want to read from. But before I do, I'll give you the background. What what I kind of stumbled upon, there are many different ancient Egyptian themes going on in the novel because Rose is an Egyptologist, and I found so many of the stuff I researched so fascinating and so applicable to the themes I was talking about. You know, when you say history repeats itself, it's very interesting to look back at history that is 4,000 and 5,000 years old, and to understand how the people who lived back then thought and acted, and then to still see the similarities to us today. I thought that was fascinating. But one of the most fascinating stories I came across was the ancient Egyptian myth of the afterlife, and particularly of the judgment and the afterlife. So ancient Egyptians believed that there was an afterlife, that people would get resurrected, and that they would have to stand in front of 42 judges and declare their innocence of 42 different transgressions. At the end of these declarations, they were called the 42 negative confessions, and we'll get to that. At the end of this, the people would then have to have their heart, the person's heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, who is the goddess of truth and justice. And if the heart was contaminated with even an iota of malice, if the heart was not pure, then the person would not be granted the eternity in the afterlife with the gods. Instead, the heart would get devoured by a god with the head of a crocodile, and the person would basically vanish. So it's not a heaven and hell thing, it's a heaven or nothing thing, basically. So I'm gonna read a little section from the novel now. It's from page 31 that talks about this, and then I'm gonna explain why I found this so fascinating thematically. So in this section, Rose is basically thinking about this ancient Egyptian myth of the afterlife and what it means. The 42 negative confessions supposedly uttered at the weighing of the heart ceremony, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of Judgment Day, to declare one's heart free of malice and suitable for an eternity in the afterlife. I have not caused pain. I have not caused weeping. I have not killed. I have not commanded to kill. I have not made suffering for anyone. 42 declarations of innocence of different transgressions, from lying to blasphemy to murder, from mistreating orphans to defrauding people, some even proclaiming that one has not harmed cattle or birds or fish. An almost hysterical insistence on having lived a guiltless life, all leading up to the last assertion. I am pure, I am pure, I am pure, I am pure. The right words uttered at the right time to produce a desired effect. Rose has always found this longing to be pure fascinating, has imagined people who lived thousands of years ago uttering that last line with desperate vehemence, probably hoping that if they believed in their own goodness, the gods would believe in it too, as if declaring one's innocence were enough to will such innocence into existence. Now, here's what fascinates me the most about this. It's not the idea of someone being pure. I don't think anyone is really pure, if you think about it. It's more the notion of this constant pursuit of the perception of purity. So, in the ancient Egyptian myth of the afterlife, the person is basically standing in front, 42 judges, and declaring that they lived a guiltless life, that they were pure. So the idea is that people needed to convey the image that they didn't do anything wrong. Now, the trick, of course, in this myth is that whatever they said doesn't count if their heart ends up actually weighing more than the feather, because then that proves that they were lying. So in a way, it's not that ancient Egyptians didn't think about the fact that people may actually lie in front of these 42 judges in the afterlife. They understood the complexity of that, But what I find most fascinating is that people who lived 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, needed to believe that they were good. Now, if you think about how this applies to what I mentioned earlier, motives and justification, whatever people do, whatever justification they give for what they do, and this applies, in my opinion, from the most heinous acts like the terrorist attack that I talk about in the novel, to everything we do in our everyday lives. People always justify what they're doing in a way that makes them look good, right? No, very few people, maybe, I don't want to generalize, but very few people would actually admit that they're behaving out of selfish motives, for example. Everyone has a way to justify what they're doing and to make it seem as if they are on the right side, right? This also goes to people on different political sides. It applies to many, many situations. And in this novel, it applies to almost every character. I found it fascinating to think about how people present their motives, how people want to be seen by others as if they're doing things for right motives, how they want to see themselves as good, how they want to see that whatever they're doing because they are justified in doing so. And then think about the actual motives that those people may actually have to do whatever they're doing. I think if we take this approach, if we understand that the justification that people give for their actions are not always the same as the real motives, that they may not even be aware of the fact that their justifications are different from their real motives, I think that takes us a step closer to understanding why people do what they do, from the terrorist who thinks it's okay to kill innocent people, to people in marriages, people in relationships who take these minor, small decisions that then accumulate and can end up defining a relationship. So I thought it was just fascinating to think about that. And if you do get to read the novel, keep that in mind, because it colored the way I painted every single character, I think. I think it's interesting to think of the different characters, from Rose to Gamila to Mark to Sabr, the suicide bomber, and see how they acted and why they acted the way they acted. And it becomes interesting as you go deeper into the novel and as Rose starts discovering more and more things about Gamila and finding out how many secrets Gamila actually held, which is also another theme in the novel. So one last thing I want to touch on is another one of the themes that came across that I hadn't planned on including here, which is the theme of home. And I want to end with that, considering the current situation and considering that we're all quarantined, probably to a certain degree, in our respective homes, because I thought it would be relevant. And when I was working on this, I specifically was thinking about how home is defined and how immigrants end up making a home in their new respective places. Because if you think about it, part of what makes a home is a sense of familiarity, right? You're used to it, you know it. But what if you move to a new place? What if you move to a new country where people are different, where everything is different? And how do you end up making your own home and feeling at home in that new place as an immigrant? And I'm gonna read a section, but and I'm gonna end with that. And in this section, Rose is actually in West Virginia, which is where her husband Mark is originally from. So in a way, he is a transplant as well. He is originally from West Virginia, but he worked as an international correspondent, and he ended up settling down in New York City. So, and it's also interesting for me, having lived in West Virginia for 14 years now, and having lived in New York and in Los Angeles and in New Jersey before that, to see the differences between the different states as well. And in a way, it's almost like an immigration when you move from one state to the other, in my at least experience. But here Rose is in West Virginia, visiting her in-laws with Mark, and she thinks about something that Mark had told her. So she is standing on her in-law on the deck of her in-law's house. And this is the section I want to read. She leans against the deck's railing, watching a pair of squirrels chase each other across the lawn. Now more than ever does she believe Mark's claim that belonging starts with an identification with the place, not the people. The natives may take you in, or they may refuse to do so, regardless of how long you've lived among them, he had once told her as they strolled along the Nile. But places are always more welcoming. Places don't care where you were born or how long you've lived in them. If you like them and make the effort to know them, they make you feel like you belong there. It's their gift to you, their way of liking you back. Throughout his travels, Mark had made it a priority to know the place that was to become his home. In his first years in New York and later in Lebanon and Egypt, he had kept journals with folded up maps nestled within their pages, had scribbled descriptions of the most random of spots. The corner of 36th and Broadway, where he tried honey roasted nuts for the first time. The brick paved stretch of Hamra Street in Beirut, where he often stood under the same palm tree and watched the stores light up at dusk. The row of shops bordering the Zamalek Sporting Club in Cairo, the first bench on the right-hand side as one walks off the Qasr Nil Bridge, the coffee shop a few steps below the sidewalk on Al-Mu'izz Street. The more of these random nooks he could claim an intimate knowledge of, the more he felt at home. And this is actually something that is steeped in my personal experience. I get the question a lot, and it's something that I hadn't thought about at all. But people, because the protagonist of this novel is kind of like almost my age and she's Egyptian American, people assume that this is autobiographical. It's not in any way autobiographical. But the one thing that is actually related to my personal experience is this, the way that I have come to make all the different homes I've made since I came to the United States more than 2 decades ago. Again, I lived in New York, New Jersey, California, and in West Virginia. And every time I moved to a new place, I have found that the most anchoring thing that I could do was to get to know the place itself. Once you know the new town or city you moved to, once you know the street where your new apartment is located at, once you know how the deli looks like inside, how the grocery store is organized, once you know where to find the milk in the grocery store, you start to feel more at home. You start to feel more like this is where I live, and this is where I am at peace, and this is where I can make my life. And the same applies, of course, to the actual physical space we inhabit, to your actual room, to your house, to your desk, your bookshelves, whatever it is that you have at home that makes you feel at home. So as I close this, I hope that you are comfortable in your own homes. I hope that you can find peace wherever you are. If you do end up reading the novel, or if you have any questions, please reach out to me. My favorite part of all readings is always the Q&A section, which is what we would have been doing now. I would have closed now and I would have been taking questions from you. But since we are not physically together, please take advantage of the various ways you can reach me online. I am on social media, on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. Just look up Rajia Hassib, my name. I have a website, rajiahassib.com, and you can email me through the website, or you can leave a comment here if that's applicable. But, shoot me a question if you can think of one, and, stay safe. And I hope you enjoy reading the book, and thank you so much for joining me. Thanks.